those who don't know me, my name is Natalie Frank. I am the head of community at Honeybook and the co-founder of the Rising Tide Society. And I want to welcome you today to our Global Tuesdays Together event. For those of you who are new, the Rising Tide Society is a community of small business owners and creative entrepreneurs who unite in the spirit of community over competition. We have hundreds of local chapters led by extraordinary volunteer leaders, co-leaders, and chairs. We have a Facebook group with over 70,000 community members facilitated by the world's best team of moderators, and educational resources released almost daily, including blog posts, webinars, templates, monthly downloadable guides, and much more, completely free for our community. We believe that when creatives rise, when small business owners are empowered to thrive, that the entire world is changed for the better. And so, as many of you know, last year in 2020, it became clear that it was no longer safe to gather in person and for our chapters to be meeting in person. And so we decided to take our monthly meetup online, and with an overwhelmingly positive response, we've continued to do it month over month and will continue to do it month over month into the future. And today we are talking about an incredibly important topic: inclusive client experience. I am honored, truly honored, and I mean this, and I said this when I emailed Kay to even see if she would have the time in her schedule to join us for this. I am honored to have Kay Fabella joining us today. And for those of you who don't know Kay, I'm going to share with you a little bit about our extraordinary guest today. Kay is a Forbes-featured DEI consultant and the founder of Inclusion in Progress, LLC. Kay Fabella has worked with companies like Instagram, the IMF, Philips, Red Hat, and PepsiCo to improve inclusive communication between diverse team members, to retain top talent and reduce turnover, and to build a culture of belonging to prepare companies for the future of work. A Filipina American in Spain since 2010, Kay draws from her lived experiences as a multi-hyphenate woman of color, a daughter of immigrants, and an immigrant herself to build bridges for belonging. She believes that more inclusive workplace culture starts with psychological safety, to share nonlinear stories, to embed empathy, expand worldviews, and increase employee engagement and innovation. While she finalizes her first book on DEI, which we all cannot wait for, and we can't wait to support you in, you can listen to her industry insights and interviews on her 5-star podcast, Inclusion in Progress. Kay, thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited and honored to have you, and I can't wait for this community to learn from you.
I am your biggest fan, you know that. I wish social distancing and distances, like in general, would allow me to hug you. But until the next time we meet, thank you. Thank you. It's my honor to be here. I'm so excited to be here in community with all of you. For a bit of background about me before we dive in, how I got involved with Rising Tide and Honeybook was because I remember reaching out to the amazing Kate, who many of you know. And I said, hey, why isn't there a chapter in Madrid, Spain? And she said, you could start one. And I did run it for a couple of years, and unfortunately, due to obligations, I had to step away. But it was an incredible experience, and this is how I've come to know and love everything that this community stands for. And so when Natalie reached out to me, when the Rising Tide team reached out to me, I was like, hell yes, I am in. So there are a million ways this conversation could go. I'm going to do my best as much as possible to make it actionable, to make it feel empowering, and really to make it almost like, as I was saying before we hit record, a kind of choose your own adventure. With that said, there will be a caveat. I will not be able to cover every single business model. I will not be able to cover every single, product or service-based business, from now into the future. Please know that I will do my best to kind of cover as much as I can to give you the basic vocabulary to move forward, and then for you to decide how it is that you want to implement these lessons. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let us hope that tech is on my side. Yay! Okay, looks like it works. Fantastic. So thank you again, Natalie, for that introduction, and hello to all you Tiders from all over the world, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm happy to be with you today to talk about how to create an inclusive client experience by embedding inclusion as a lens in your business. And so to give you a bit of background on what we're here to do today, My name is Kay Fabella, and I'm here to take a stand against boxes. No, not these boxes. These identity boxes. And if you're here live today, you're here to help me break these boxes open and build more bridges together as creatives and business owners. Because boxes like these are the reason why we're here today. And if this past year has taught us anything, it's how much more we gain when we listen to the experiences of those we perceive as other or different, rather than putting them in a box that they never belonged in. So today is going to be very fast paced, as I let you know. We're going to be looking at first where these boxes come from and how they shape our biases, which affects obviously how we show up as business owners, the core mindsets that we need to break boxes and build bridges in our business and to cultivate belonging. And finally, how you can start embedding inclusion in your business today with, again, some basic vocabulary and some ideas and some new lenses for how you can show up in your work and in the world. Because we all rise and fall together as members of the same human family. And we all have a part to play, especially as business owners, to make sure that the next normal that we build together is more free and more fair for all of us. And the truth is, if we are here to raise the tide for everyone today, we need all hands on deck. So if you're ready to accept this invitation today, type an "I'm in the chat for me. I'm going to see if I can see all of your lovely chat. I'm like going back and forth between two screens. Go ahead. I'm in. Whoop, whoop. Awesome. I'm so in. All right. I love this group already. I love it. All right. So go ahead, let's get started. So for you to understand a little bit more about why I care so much about breaking down boxes and building inclusion through the businesses that we run, you need to understand a little bit of my story. So I was born and raised in the US and have called Madrid, Spain home since 2010, coming up on my 11th Spaniversary this month. What? Where does the time go? But growing up back in my birth country, on every standardized test you take, you're asked to select the one box that best defines who you are. Now, as a second-generation daughter of Filipino immigrants growing up in California, taking her very first ever test, I thought that I had two choices. Was I Asian or was I a Pacific Islander? I mean, could you blame me? No one told me that one of the test questions would be, "Excuse me, little girl, how do you categorize yourself based on where you think your parents come from?" They didn't tell me to study for that one, so hence the confusion. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that my confusion was actually kind of justified, and that I realized just how limiting that identity box was, like so many of them are. Because fun fact, here's everyone that falls under the Asian identity box: 48 countries, 49 if you count Russia, but let's be honest, not many people do. And here's everyone who falls under the Pacific Islander identity box. So imagine trying to fit people from 68, 69-ish countries, this gorgeous mosaic of cultures, of languages, of religions and traditions, into an itty-bitty living space. If you know that reference, please type it in the chat. And asking people to self-identify with a box that they think best fits them. Now, outside of standardized tests, my identity crisis, we'll say, continued. Let's put it this way. When you have a, shall we say, a face that doesn't immediately fit into one box, you're always asked a second question whenever you meet someone new. The first being, "Where are you from?" Immediately followed by a, no. Where are you really from? So who here has had to answer the second question? And for this, I'm going to ask you to type in your best pirate "I" in the chat. I. Oh, someone got the Aladdin reference. Yes. I. Yep, definitely. I. Good. Good. Yeah, you're still got an I, matey. Very nice. Very nice. All right, you're all still with me. Cool. And as an extension of that, who here has been put in a box that someone else checked for them? Type a yup in the chat if that's you. Yup. Yep. Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. We've all been there, right? That's the point. At the end of the day, our identities are ever changing and ever evolving, and we know how unfair it feels when somebody places a box on us that we never got a say in, right? They flatten us to one part of who we are in our schools, in our workplaces, and when we're out in the world, sometimes to very disappointing results. For example, in 2005, a high school classmate signed my yearbook saying I was a mediocre Asian because I excelled at writing instead of math and science. In 2008, it's kind of a more fun story, one of my cab drivers when I was visiting Bali literally couldn't believe me when I said I was from the US and said, "But why your face like me?" In 2010, when I first moved to Spain, a man in a suit in broad daylight asked me to kiss him like a good Asian girl, whatever that means. And in 2020, with the rise in anti-Asian incidents during the pandemic, well, there's not enough time today for all of those stories. And think about it, I'm just one person, right? With one set of lived experiences because of boxes others have assigned to me. And on that spectrum of experiences, I'm actually the lucky one, right? So I don't have to worry about whether or not going out on a run or driving or walking out of a convenience store or even sleeping in my own bed could be the difference between someone seeing me as fully human, worthy of the right to live or not. Because the fact is, these boxes shape how we treat each other. Boxes become biases, biases become beliefs, beliefs become behaviors, behaviors become harassment, and harassment sometimes, in the worst case scenario, becomes violence. And the human cost to us is high, no matter what form it takes. And it shouldn't have to take an extreme to pay attention. Because if you took time to look beyond the box that you see, you get to know the professional me, who's pretty awesome, I might add, as well as the other parts of me that you can't see. That would give you a broader view of who I am, including my not so secret wish that my life was a musical. See what I mean? The taste of your lips, I wanna write. You're toxic, I'm stepping on the taste of my poison paradise. Addicted to you, don't you know that you're toxic? And I love what you do, don't you know that you're toxic? So yes, I am a 90s kid. I am not ashamed of my love for Britney Spears. Free Britney. No, these are just a few facets of who I am, right? Now think of the ideas, the insights, the joy that we lose out on when we box people in before we get to know them, right? How boxes stop us from going beyond the first thing that we see to the things we don't see behind physical identifiers and behind the grid chapter of 9 photos that someone just posted on Instagram, right? Think of how many more ideas we'd have access to in the online business world, how many more people that we could impact if we move beyond the boxes that people place on us and the ones that we may place on them. Now, for me, I learned early on that I will always be assigned a box by someone else unless I led with my story. And it's why I've made it my mission to amplify the voices of the so-called onlys in the room, to help them embrace their so-called differences, to expand possibilities for themselves and for those in their communities that come after them. It's also why I've spent the better part of a decade learning how to invite more people into this conversation on inclusion, even if they don't come from a so-called minority background. And it's the core of the work my team and I do around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI at Inclusion in Progress. So I know from speaking to hundreds of professionals that this identity struggle is real. Because instead of showing up and being seen for your innate worth as a human, which is what we all want, for the impact that you bring to others through your role or through your business, you're in this constant battle to be seen beyond that identity box that you check and the accompanying stereotypes that may or may not be assigned to you. And the more nonlinear your story is, the more identity boxes there may be for you to break out of. Imagine how many boxes a Black, Muslim, queer woman has to break out of to be seen for the value that they bring instead of their physical packaging. But hey, listen, I get why we do it. I get why we box people in. And from working with companies like Instagram and Red Hat, Philips, and more, I learned that boxes like these are particularly helpful as reference points to identify what historically excluded populations need, which helps us then troubleshoot for how to solve for that inequality, as well as set a benchmark for us to work toward, measuring what is and isn't working, and highlighting a path to progress when that equality is achieved. So knowing that these boxes can actually be kind of helpful, should our goal to be to eliminate them altogether and therefore eliminate our biases in the process? Type a yes or a no in the chat. Should our goal to be eliminate our boxes and biases altogether? I already saw the confusion for Whitney. Yeah, that was actually done on purpose. Technically, both answers are correct, right? Hey, you get a chicken dinner and you get a chicken dinner and you get a vegan dinner. Let's be inclusive. So if you answered no, you're right, because I know, a trick question. We can't eliminate our biases entirely, right? And if you answered yes, although it would be nice to be able to eradicate all of our biases altogether, that would actually go against our biological human programming, right? So here's what I mean. Now, our brains are amazing, but they have a capacity problem. So if our brains were running at full capacity every minute, all the time, we wouldn't make it past 9:01 a.m. on a Monday. And I don't know about y'all, but I got a lot of things to do after 9:01 a.m. on a Monday, right? At any one moment, we're taking in 11 million pieces of information. We can consciously process 40 bits of information at any one time. So our brain is actually trying to help us. It's creating shortcuts based off of past knowledge. So for us to not have to consciously process every single thing, we run a lot of that processing on automatic. And the more that we use those shortcuts, the more that we are forming our preferred patterns of automatic thinking. Do you prefer the beach or the mountains? Do you prefer traveling by rail or by car? Things like that. And it's when we use these shortcuts, when it comes to people, that we can miss out on important information or ideas. And it's those shortcuts or biased thinking that can sometimes often be wrong. So if we can't get rid of our biases completely, what can we do instead? So let's try this example. I can't see your faces, but type in the chat, yes, if you, or me rather, if you are a photographer. And yes, that could mean as your full-time business or former full-time business, or for those of us who are using our cell phones to snap shots of our kids, pets, or food. No judgment. Me? Okay. All right, so quite a few of you, as I suspected, there's a lot of creatives here, a lot of visual folks. All right, so if you are a photographer, you know that shifting the view through the viewfinder by a few degrees can completely change what you see, right? Each of us sees things in a certain way based on where we come from and how we understand ourselves. So even if we can shift that view just a few degrees, we can see things that we may not have noticed otherwise. So now we're going to take a look at the common frame that people take when approaching their biases or trying to engage in this inclusion conversation in their business, which is this: I'm not biased, I view things objectively. Now contrast that with this reframe: bias exists in everyone, including me. I actively think about how my biases affect the way I view myself and others and the boxes I place on them, and how I work to interrupt them. And when we're more actively thinking about bias, it goes from unconscious to conscious. We can check for maybe false or incorrect assumptions and judgments that we're making. We become more willing to change our minds. We can make better decisions, which in turn affects our clients and our communities. Now that reframe here is that shift in the viewfinder, the shift in perspective that we all need to make to effectively address our biases, to dismantle those boxes, and embed inclusion into our businesses. So let's take a look at another example. Now, who's the first person that comes to mind when I say business owner? Now, don't overthink this one. Just think of the first person that pops into your head and type that into the chat now. Me, yes. All right, maybe someone who's not me. First person that pops into your head. Some of the answers when I've done a similar workshop have been like Richard Branson or, you know, Tim Cook, or notice a trend? Generally be a man. There we go, Erin. She understood where I was going with that. Awesome. So obviously there's some great business owners here, and kudos to all of you. You are all redefining this story already in real time. But depending on where you are in the world, there's a high likelihood that the mental image that you have of a business owner looks something like this or this. But when we go beyond our brain's shortcut, why couldn't or why shouldn't a business owner look like her or them or her or her or her or her? The truth is, we all put people in boxes. We're all making snap judgments about others based on our identity and our lived experiences. Even if we think we're good people, bias is in the air we breathe. And we've been breathing the same recycled air for centuries. Now, the biases you have determine the boxes that you put other people in, and they're reinforced by the boxes that we've learned to categorize other people. So let's take a quick look at where these boxes come from. I'm nerding out a little bit because I love me some history, but I figured this was helpful for y'all as well. Turns out that most of the identity boxes that we know, especially the racial and ethnic ones, come from the US Census. And the way these boxes define us affects how we talk about inclusion across the globe. So you can actually go to the US Census's website to see this very same graphic. But since the first census in 1790, the US government identified different groups of Americans over time, from the days of slavery to the recent waves of immigration. It wasn't until 1960 with the Civil Rights Movement that people could self-identify and select their own racial or ethnic group. And it wasn't until 2000 that Americans could choose more than one racial identity to describe themselves. And unfortunately, those same boxes also drive DEI initiatives around the world, as we've witnessed firsthand, as many companies are actually headquartered in the United States. And the biggest piece of feedback that my team and I hear from clients outside the US is, why should these boxes matter to us? The inclusion police is coming, you can hear them. They don't reflect our history, they don't reflect our language, they don't reflect our cultures. Even though these boxes were originally created to include others, the identity boxes are often used to create exclusion instead. Take, for instance, what happened to Antonio Banderas, one of the most famous Spaniards at the 2020 Oscars. So American outlets like Vanity Fair called Banderas, who was nominated for Best Actor, an actor of color. And the thing is, Banderas is from Malaga, Spain, and does not identify as a person of color. Of course, there are non-white Spanish people, but that isn't the case for him as a European. When he was asked about the controversy, Banderas recalled filling out an official form when he first landed in the US. And as he went to check the box for white under race, he was told that he was wrong, that he was Hispanic. Even though he rightly pointed out that Hispanic wasn't actually a race, but rather a cultural label for Spanish speakers, he filled out the identity box that was assigned to him as a non-American. Maybe you might not have heard of this too much, but I can tell you in my adopted country of Spain, that was a pretty fierce conversation about what is race, what does it mean, what is life? But anyway, just goes to show you how it shows up and it affects other people, right? So identity boxes ultimately become harmful when they become the period full stop in our conversations around inclusion, when we're relying only on those shortcuts or assumptions. And more importantly, when we're leaning on the identity box of a group to describe who one individual is and treat everyone from that group as if they were a monolith. Not only that, these boxes condition how historically excluded groups see ourselves, because you have so few role models of people who look like you, who love like you, or who live like you, that the only reference point that you have is sometimes a very small collection or a stereotype that you're desperate to rebel against or run away from. And that lack of representation in the online business world, well, like the biases in our brains, that isn't entirely our fault either. Because historically, businesses were designed for those who were able to and allowed to work first, who then brought in more people who looked and acted and thought like them. And we see this in our corporate structures and workplaces even today. That's why my team and I have a job. But as demographics shift, as multicultural, multi-ethnic populations grow, we now get to look at the groups that fell further from that straight, white European, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, male center, and start thinking about how we can give these people access to rooms and resources that they need to thrive. Yeah. There's no clearer example than the pandemic that we're all still living through, right? Even though the rains of COVID-19 rain down on all of us, as we learned, not all of us are in the same boat. And as businesses start to open back up again in parts of the world, as we step into this next normal, we have a responsibility to ask ourselves, how can we continue to raise the tide for everyone, as individuals and as business owners? And as businesses open up again, how can we make this next normal after the pandemic a fairer place for all of us to do business? Well, that starts with literally breaking out of our boxes and embracing a multi-hyphenate approach to how we do business with people from diverse groups. Now, to me, being a multi-hyphenate is simple. You're someone who embraces your own multi-layered identities in order to redefine worldviews, foster understanding, and build inclusion for others. And I think that multi-hyphenates, if this is a role that you so choose, are the best equipped to lead inclusion in this next normal of online business. And any one of us can become one. So let's break down how we do that. First, we have to understand our own whole selves, acknowledging where we've been on the receiving end of exclusion as well as advantage. So I identify as a woman of color, and I've already shared where I've experienced exclusion. At the same time, I'm also cisgender, I'm a native English speaker, I'm able-bodied, the list goes on, right? Understanding your multi-hyphenate identity allows you to see the intersectionality, kudos to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, of where you've experienced both bias and privilege, which helps you build deeper empathy and understanding for other members of our human family, especially in how you show up in your online business. So by now we're aware of the consequences of racial, ethnic, and gender identity boxes, but what about all the other dimensions of diversity? The social and cultural identifiers that define us as humans. How we respond to or fall under any one of these groups determines how our identity is shaped and how we see the world. Now, depending on where you are, what stage of business we're at, and the time that you have available, this is very important given our pandemic time, we will all fall somewhere on this spectrum of allyship when it comes to how we learn to support people from different groups. Some of us may be well into our advocacy journey for members of the LGBTQIA community, while others are closer to the beginning of their journey when it comes to the immigrant or disability community. Awareness of your biases is the first step. And while you can't eradicate your bias or dismantle all of these boxes overnight, you can actively commit to an ongoing journey of learning and unlearning and deciding how to apply what you've learned into creating an inclusive business. So let's start small. Where might have you had access to opportunities that others might not have? And how can you raise the floor or raise the tide for them? How did it feel, excuse me, how did it feel when someone placed you in a box without giving you an opportunity to share your story first? Seeing things through that lens, as we continue in our endless pursuit towards more unity and understanding of one another, embracing our hyphens, where we've experienced both exclusion and advantage, helps us decide which aspect of inclusion we can work on in our business first. Embracing our multiple hyphens also helps us acknowledge the unseen in others. Take, for example, this man. Now, on first glance, what do you see? You can type it into the chat if you like, but I think most people see this. Many of you would probably say things like he's won the genetic lottery and he's won the privilege Olympics, something along those lines. We're being a little creative here, right? But what if I told you that he's actually queer, Jewish, dyslexic, and a survivor of both sexual abuse and cancer? How would that change your understanding of who he is? Don't immediately jump for the boxes in your head. Because the truth is, any single one of these boxes that we may use to define others are the same boxes others use to define and categorize us. whether that's physical ability, accent, sexual orientation, age, country of origin, veteran status, race or ethnicity, gender identity, religious beliefs, family status, mental illness, culture, geographic location, socioeconomic status, education, learning style, personality type, political beliefs, and more. Now, this doesn't mean you have to go out and get 3 master's degrees in DEI to be able to run your online business and learn how to be an ally for all of these groups. But understanding someone else's hyphens, acknowledging what you see and don't see, allows you to shorten the distance between you and other much faster and accelerate understanding. Now, in addition to some of the more obvious diversity dimensions that we've looked at, start thinking about the not so obvious identity dimensions you may not have considered for others before in your audience. Whether that's neurodiversity or learning styles such as ADHD, immigrant status, native languages, accessibility for those who are hard of hearing, those who silently are grieving after suffering a miscarriage, veterans returning to civilian life, or those who survived the foster care system. Instead of focusing on just one ideal client avatar in your business, who may or may not come from a similar background or worldview to you, consider what it might be like to speak to people who fall into any one of these groups and try to center them in your message and mission instead. Because evidence shows that centering historically excluded groups in our businesses leads to greater diversity in our teams and customers and better business outcomes. Who doesn't want that? Now, a great example of this was actually this shoe, which you can see in GIF form, Go Fly Ease, which was Nike's first hands-free shoe. Now, it was designed initially with accessibility in mind, so the wearer just needs to slip their foot in and push down in order to put it on. The idea of this shoe actually garnered mass market appeal. Not only that, but seeing an example of how a company like Nike, however imperfectly, centered around the too often overlooked disabled community is inspiring other product-focused businesses to do the same. We all have the ability to affect change. We all have the ability to model impact. It starts with just one of us. Now, seeing this list of all of our diversity dimensions can feel a little bit intimidating and feel overwhelming when you don't know where to start or how you want to show up first. I acknowledge that. You're afraid that if you don't have the right vocabulary, you don't have maybe an up-to-date inclusive language library at your fingertips, that you'll get it wrong, when the reality is you can reframe that overwhelm as opportunity. Because the clients that you have today won't look like the clients that you have tomorrow, because census data is showing that the next 20 to 30 years, populations of color, descendants of immigrants and refugees, multiracial adoptees, location-independent nomads, and multicultural families will be the majority and not the minority. They want to feel, like all of us do, seen, heard, valued, respected, and represented when they come across your brand and business. So maybe you've gone through some level of loss in your business, or maybe you've gone through some level of loss in your own life. Whatever you can tap into from your own lived experience to leverage that empathy into how you show up for others, do so. And how can you do that in your marketing, your messaging, your mission, and the model of how you do your business moving forward? Last but not least, embrace yes and. Now, for those of you who may come from a theater background, yes and is essentially like a mosaic of leaps of faith and trust. Like somebody says, the box is yellow. Yes, the box is yellow. And then so on and so forth to make comedy gold, right? I believe in our ability as humans to hold space for two truths, right? It's far too easy for us to focus the inclusion conversation in business on who's winning the oppression Olympics and who isn't. When the reality is every single one of us lives on this hyphen, somewhere between advantage and exclusion, and somewhere in between wanting to do better and learning how to do it and become better in the process. So rather than looking for one single phrase or one single framework or one single way forward to implement inclusion in your business or client experience, I invite you to consider the complexity of identity and the world that we live in today and see things through that lens instead. No one single framework that I invent today is going to help every business here, nor will it help every business tomorrow, because people that weren't historically allowed to sit at the table are finally finding their voices. They're exercising their right to speak their stories into existence, many for the first time. So they're driving the evolution of the language and how we do business. So even though equality may be our shared goal, equity is the process that helps us to clear the barriers to equal access for those who didn't have that access before, which then helps us determine what we need to do in our businesses to design solutions that expand our definition of who our ideal clients are to better reflect and represent the full diversity of our human experiences. So instead of asking which group you should learn from first, maybe ask yourself, who are the voices that I'm currently learning from? Who are the voices that I'm centering in my message, my mission, and my model of business? And who are the voices that I can keep amplifying in my business to reflect the type of world that I want to live in and leave behind? Because you're not responsible for the first identity box that you think of, but you are responsible for what you do next. Do you stop at your first thought? Or do you create space for that yes and, followed by another and another and, to invite more voices and people into conversation with you? So my challenge to you is to break out of those identity boxes that you know, to embrace your whole self first and the other in front of you, so that no matter who they are, they can show up as their whole selves too. And center that to make your client experience inclusive and prepare your business for the future of our world, which I think we all want to see be a freer, fairer place. All right, so that brings us to the conclusion of the workshop portion of the call today. So while I take a quick break to sip water before answering some of your pre-submitted questions, please type in the chat one key takeaway that you learned from this session with us. And I'll take a quick sip here. Bias is in the air we breathe. Yep. Yeah, definitely. All right. Giving you a lot to chew on. It's all good. Don't worry, there is a recording. You can watch this later. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So I did have a few questions that came through. So, okay, cool. Oh, okay, Linda said, to be conscious of how we are looking at the world through our own bias and how to move past that. Absolutely. Yeah, love that. Hi, I own a princess entertainment company sending princesses to private and corporate events. What are some ways I can further my inclusive reach? So I guess for me, it's, well, who can be a princess? And exactly, anyone. So who falls under anyone? And defining that for yourself, whether it's your own message or the marketing that you put out there, or even saying things like, you know, even gender identity, as we know, is not as fixed or as it was. It's more fluid. So it could be women identifying as well. I mean, there are multiple ways that you can start even just showcasing, here are the different stories of who can be a princess. And they can fall under, oh, Erin's beating me to the punch, different races or ethnicities or genders, as well as, you know, different abilities or different locations in the world. So Kate, the viewfinder analogy really helped me. Love that. I'm so glad. Fantastic. I know there's a lot of photographers here. I figured that would be helpful. Very cool. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to try and get through a couple of questions, but if you have any additional ones, please feel free to type them into the chat as well. And Natalie or Wendy will shout them out to me just in case I don't see them. All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just pull from here very quickly. Okay. All right, are there any specific incredible resources to continue educating oneself on inclusivity within one's own processes and content? Okay, so for this, again, as you saw, there are multiple different ways you can learn to be more inclusive. So really, it's kind of a choose your own adventure, what you want to learn first, right? If you want to learn about anti-racism, anti-Black racism specifically, I mean, there's a whole host of things now. I know Honeybook has done a really good job of putting those things out on the website. So please look into that. The other thing, the easiest thing, honestly, for me, even on my own allyship journey or awareness journey for helping different groups, is trying to ask myself all the same questions. Who are the voices that I'm learning from? And if they're not as diverse as I'd like them to be, how can I try and bear witness to their stories? We live in such an incredible time. All of you here are creatives. You know how many options we have at our disposal for content. We've got Netflix, we've got podcasts, we've got, Rising Tide sharing their amazing resources. There's so many different ways that you can learn and interact. So it's just a matter of who's, say, for example, on Instagram, who's on my feed, who am I learning from? What are the podcasts that I'm listening to? And really, it's my only caveat to this, if you're looking for credible, there's a difference between lived experience and saying, oh, now this lived experience that from this one person now helps me, learn how to talk to this group. No, remember, we're not monoliths, right? The same way women aren't monoliths, the same way Americans aren't monoliths, the same way, et cetera, et cetera. So look through it, when you're actively seeking out resources, look first for history, look for identity groups, and as much as possible, wherever you can dive deeper into your learning. This is how I challenge myself. For example, I watched Laverne Cox's movie on Netflix about the representation of trans people in media. And I challenged myself to find a book afterwards to continue learning, or to find a podcast interview, because she's an incredibly prolific speaker. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and I found more of, other takes that she had or other stories that maybe she didn't get a chance to cover. So really it's just, what's the one thing that I want to learn first? And then after the one thing that I want to learn first, how can I challenge myself to see and widen that keyhole? And therefore that expands my view of the world. Yeah. In terms of coursework, there's a ton of incredible people doing this. One of my good friends is Erica Corday. She's doing incredible work around inclusion, especially in B2C. I unfortunately no longer do one-on-one client work, so I would not be the person for you, but I highly recommend looking for folks like her. There's so many in the space, and there's many more that I'm not able to amplify in the short amount of time. So yeah, I think that's something that could be an interesting thing to add for a future Tuesdays Together talk. I know there's lots of folks who want to continue learning. So decide what it is that you want to do first. What do you want to learn about first? And sometimes the easiest place to start is, what's in my lived experience? Yeah. Okay, so how can I be inclusive without it coming off as tokenism, specifically as a photographer when using models for my portfolio? So my only thing here is, I personally prefer to see generally we could do better than we are doing now in terms of representation. So any effort, even if you feel like it's clumsy or you're worried about being labeled in a specific way, there are different ways that you can approach this. So in terms of the models for your portfolio, if you're staging a shoot, maybe it's paying those people, right? Maybe you wouldn't have thought to do so before. Maybe you would have asked a friend before, but maybe paying those people specifically because this is collateral that's going to, showcase what you want your business to stand for, and they deserve to be compensated for it, right? Another important part in general, and this is where I honor the diversity, equity, and inclusion calendar that we have. It's very important to have awareness days and awareness months and events to highlight specific groups. Black people are still Black after February. Women are still women after March. Asian American Pacific Islanders group, that entire monolith that I showed you earlier, that mosaic of cultures, we're all still our identity groups after May rather. So where you aren't trying to just fill in something on the calendar for the sake of linking it to an awareness day or event, that's where I think, to me, it could potentially come off as tokenism. But you can, as long as you're highlighting people's stories in a way that feels good to you, I think that's the best that you can do. Yeah, and that actually brings me to an important point on this, which is, Brene Brown has a really, really great mantra for this. I'm not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. You're not going to get it right. There are many times I put my foot in it, right? I lean into the fact that I'm human, that I can be humble. Somebody's challenged me called me up to a different version of who I could be for them as an ally. And I take that invitation. So maybe it's leaning into that as well. And looking at that intention when you're deciding whether or not when you're worried about it being tokenism. All right, let's see. What's your advice on promoting inclusive attitudes in a region that has very little diversity? Ooh, yeah, this is a big one. I think in general, thing is, even in regions, because we're in a pandemic, we've learned virtual, like we're all here from different states and different countries tuning in. I mean, honestly, there are so many different ways that you can not just reach out to other people who may not be from a specific region if you're looking to align with them or ally with them and learn from them. But really, sometimes it just takes one person. I was speaking to a woman who's in Belize, and she was like, I feel like I'm the only woman business owner in Belize posting on Instagram. So like people stop me in the street and I'm like, oh my gosh, what? And that feels a little intimidating. I'm like, wow, that's some street cred. People recognize you in the street, that's celebrity status. I digress. But what I think is important is just the fact that she's showing up, even if she's just the one person, people are looking to her as a model, right? And maybe not everybody will resonate, but maybe some people are looking at what she's saying and thinking, oh my gosh, she has the courage to say that what I couldn't. She's amplifying her story and she's giving me permission to share mine. And I think that's the important thing in general about representation or creating inclusion. I would rather more people trying and continuing to try to get it right than a very small group of us, myself included, DEI practitioners, speak to any one of us, hold space for us. We've been struggling this past year. I'd rather that we don't have to navigate from burnout to burnout and have more people lead with their foot on the gas pedal so that I can lie down occasionally. I'd rather more people leaning into this conversation and learning and being willing to be corrected and learn from each other than just a very small group of people doing it right or doing it perfect, because that's not the point. Or at least this is my invitation to you to not see it as a static journey. It is an ongoing evolution and it could do with your voice, however you decide to show up. All right. Can we have an inclusive client experience but still target a specific type of client that we've determined is our ideal client? So again, the ideal client avatar, which I know the ICA that we all know, love, do, have praised for our businesses, I think innately within that, and this is the hard question that we should be asking ourselves as online business owners, is whether or not that was inclusive to begin with, right? Because for a lot of us, when we did the ICA exercise, a lot of us were told to speak to us from 5 years ago or 3 years ago or 2 years ago, which is great because yay, we're solving the problem that we wanted. But within that, are we actually centering voices that we wouldn't necessarily have access to or wouldn't necessarily have been included in the first place? So when you're revisiting your ideal client avatar, one of the ways that I invited you to do in the presentation that we just looked at is consider what are ways that I could maybe, rather than focusing on that ideal client avatar because of the demographics or because of the worldview, what's maybe moving away from, I have to credit one of my mentors, Glo Atanmo, for this, moving away from like-minded to like-hearted in how we show up for that ideal client. That ideal client, if they're like-hearted, if they have the same values that we do, if they want to do better, even if they see the world through a different way or a different, lens or location or whatever it happens to be, that's who we want to speak to. And that doesn't have to fall into the same packaging as us. And so challenging ourselves to kind of, maybe it's speaking to somebody who's a veteran, who's coming back to civilian life, imagining what they would want to hear. They could still be an ideal client for a service that we have or a product we want to deliver, but what do we say to them to engage them in the conversation? If we're speaking to them from a place of like-heartedness, yeah? Okay, hope that's answered that question. What's the first question to ask your clients to build rapport and a sense of belonging or inclusion? Honestly, however you can establish rapport that isn't straight to the so-called meat and potatoes of the meeting, that's it. You know, it's like, how can I connect with you human to human first instead of business to business or business to consumer? I find that, however, I can, because you saw the million lenses that I see the world through, I can pull from that experience and say, oh, I know somebody here was in Minnesota. Like, oh my gosh, like how are you doing out there in Duluth or whatever? I have some really good friends that live there. It's really easy for me to just kind of, what's an identifier or part of their experience that I can tell is important to them? If I can strike that into the conversation first before I dive into whatever the business part of the transaction is, focus more on the relationship that I'm building with them, I feel like that's the best way to build rapport. And that's something that I think everybody already does. And yeah, I think it's just, again, like I said, insert it in as a lens that you see the world through, rather than looking for like a checklist of here's what I say on a discovery call from, start, middle to end. Okay, additionally, recommendations for inclusive language on website and client forms. I think, again, there's a million ways that you could do this. It depends on, and because I don't have the full context for the question, and that'll give me some context, I'm gonna try my best to answer. But on your website, remember that your message and the images and every way that you present yourself all should be aligned with the same story, right, of who you are. How you show up in an inclusive way is, maybe you're not shouting your pronouns out every 2 seconds, but maybe what you could be doing is thinking of things like accessibility, right? Adding alt text to your images that are actually not just SEO friendly, but really geared towards people that that see those images and use them for their benefit. I think really, for when it comes to inclusive language, and this is the important thing, we as humans are always evolving. How one person decides to be called, like I've had this conversation with multiple people within the disabled community. There are some people who love the idea of differently abled, they feel it's more inclusive, and there's some people who don't. You're not going to get it right 100%. All you can do is say, this is what I stand for. This is the type of world that I believe in and want to fight for, and that's why I've started my business. And if you're along with me for the journey, this is the place for you, and I welcome you here. And sometimes that's a good place to start. And whatever you can do to add an update to that, as we all collectively as humans learn to do and be better, we all know we can edit our websites, right? So I think that's important. And then in terms of client forms, this is a big thing for me as somebody who designs surveys. I've become very mindful of even gender identity, making sure that non-binary and prefer not to say are both there. Because just because you don't fall into the male or female binary spectrum, I don't have to force you to tell me for the sake of a survey, right? So maybe thinking of things like that, of when I'm designing systems and processes in my business and client forms, my website, et cetera, what can I do to remember that there are multiple different human experiences that I'm speaking to? And how would I, in that person, as a person who we've all said, we've all been placed in boxes we didn't want to be placed in, how would I want to be spoken to? Yeah, and thinking about that. Okay, let me see. Okay, how do we get past an area? I think I skipped this one. How do we get past an area of weakness or unintentional lack of knowledge due to unconscious bias? Watch this replay. Bias is the air we breathe, and whatever we can do to consciously interrupt it, I think it's an ongoing journey. We're all, I think, in addition to being creatives, I think I can safely assume that we're all avid learners. We've all committed to our personal development. This is just another lens. This is just another layer. So whatever you can do to not just continue learning, but maybe find somebody within this community to hold you accountable, somebody that you can unpack some of your learnings with in a safe way. I think that's much more beneficial than seeing it as a weakness. It's not a weakness. Biases are just preferences, there's shortcuts in our brain that are there to help us in general. But the unintentional lack of knowledge is something that we can intentionally check. Yeah. All right, let me see. I think we have time for one more question. How do you deal with a conflict on a team as a boss, especially as it relates to an inclusive work environment? What kind of coaching would you provide to individuals who just can't seem to get along? Oof, man, that's a tough one. You're throwing some hard balls at me, y'all. All right, so again, context is everything, and psychological safety is everything. So sometimes how each of us responds to conflict, and this is really critical for when we're creating an inclusive client experience as well as an inclusive team experience for our businesses, to remember that we're not just building spaces where we're all kumbayaing and cooperating all the time. We're creating spaces for compassionate collision. Whatever you can do to create that space for compassionate collision, do so. So if somebody maybe responds to conflict in a way that is, you know, they feel backed into a corner and they shut down, or on the flip side of that, the person who kind of rails at the other person and immediately regrets it, whatever you can do to, well, first of all, say in the moment, if it's happening in a team, say, listen, hey, I think we're getting a little bit sidetracked. I can see that this is a conversation that we need to have separately. And so I'm going to reach out to each of you afterwards to speak with each of you. But right now, I invite you to either excuse yourselves from this meeting because I can tell this is not the best place for you to have this conversation right now. And two, this is not the kind of company or not the kind of team that I feel that we should be cultivating at this time. And then speak to each of them individually, and then follow up and model with the two of them, if it is in fact two people in this case, hypothetically, what it is that you learned collectively of how you want the team to move forward. Because then just kind of sweeping the conflict under the rug and then saying, oh, we're fine now, it's all good, I don't think is beneficial either. So what do you want to model first? How do you continue to create spaces for compassionate collision, not just within your team, but also with people who may challenge you, and inviting them into conversation in community with you, and learning what you want to do with that to continue to model what inclusive leadership looks like in your business, however that looks like for you at this point in time. Yeah. All right, fantastic. Well, I think we are just about wrapping up. So thank you so much again for having me. Here are my links if you want to reach out. Again, I don't do any one-on-one client work anymore, unfortunately, as much as I love having these conversations with fellow business owners, but you can listen to our podcast and see what it looks like, what we're talking about and seeing behind the scenes in the corporate world. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, which is probably where I'm most active, or you can follow me on Twitter and my defunct Instagram, which my team has encouraged me to get back on, but you know, hey ho.
Okay, thank you from the bottom of my heart. That was absolutely phenomenal. And I wish, I always wish, Kate, there was so much chat between a couple of us behind the scenes of going, did you get that quote? Did you get that quote? It was just truly transformational, and the knowledge, the wisdom, the heart that you shared with us today, I know impacted all of us so deeply. So thank you so much. And I want to encourage everyone, please go follow Kay on all the links that Wendy just shared now in the chat. Listen to her podcast, continue to engage with her. This has been such a tremendous gift to all of us. So Kay, thank you for joining. Thank you for being here and sharing. And for everyone who tuned in today or is watching the replay of this Global Tuesdays Together, thank you for leaning into this conversation. And we hope it is the first or the middle or of many, depending on where you are in your journey, and that we continue, all of us, leaning in together. And I know this will be something we continue as a community to have conversations on, to learn about, and to lean into the months and years to come. So thank you, Kay, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Take care.